Imagine a nation resting on the largest oil reserves on the planet, a land that was once the glittering envy of South America, boasting the highest standard of living on the continent. Now, picture that same land where money is weighed instead of counted, and millions trek across borders just to survive. How does a paradise become a paradox? This is the tragic, epic history of Venezuela. Long before the maps were drawn in Madrid or the first galleon pierced the horizon of the Caribbean Sea, the land we now call Venezuela was a tapestry of diverse and vibrant cultures. It wasn't an empty wilderness waiting to be tamed. It was a home. Unlike the high Andes to the south or the Mexican valleys to the north, the indigenous peoples here didn't build monolithic stone empires like the Incas or the Aztecs. They built something different, complex, adaptive chiefdoms, perfectly in tune with the violent beauty of their environment. In the mist-shrouded peaks of the Venezuelan Andes, the Timotecuicas terraced the mountainsides. They were master agriculturalists, growing potatoes and maize in places where the air was thin and cold, trading their surplus with the lowland tribes. If you traveled down from those chilly heights to the humid, sun-drenched coast, the vibe changed entirely. Here, the Caribbean Sea crashed against the shore, and the Caribs held dominion. They were fierce, legendary warriors and navigators who treated the ocean like a highway, pushing their dugout canoes from island to island. And in the vast plains and river deltas, the Arawaks lived a life woven around the cycles of the water, relying on cassava and fishing, existing in a delicate balance with the jaguars and the Anak. It was a world of trade, warfare, and spiritual depth. A world that would be shattered forever in the summer of 1498. It was Christopher Columbus's third voyage. When his ships approached the Paria Peninsula, he was so struck by the lushness of the river delta, that fresh water mixing with the salt, that he wrote to the Spanish crown claiming he had found the land of grace, hinting it might be the Garden of Eden itself. But the name that stuck didn't come from Columbus. A year later, another explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, sailed into Lake Maracaibo. There, he saw the indigenous people living in stilt houses, known as palafitos, hovering over the water, connected by wooden bridges and canoes. It reminded him of a rustic version of his home in Italy. He jokingly called it Venezuela, Little Venice. The name evolved, hardened by the Spanish tongue, into Venezuela. The Spanish conquest here was slow and frustrating for the invaders. They were looking for the glitter of gold, for cities made of silver, but Venezuela offered none of that. It was hot, the terrain was punishing, and the indigenous resistance was ferocious, because there was no instant wealth to be stolen. Venezuela became a bit of a backwater in the Spanish Empire, neglected in favor of Mexico and Peru. But this neglect allowed a unique agrarian society to form. The colonizers turned to the soil. First it was cocoa, the rich, dark beans that fueled the chocolate addiction of European aristocracy. Later it was coffee, but we cannot romanticize this. This economy was built on the back of the encomienda system, which enslaved the indigenous population, and later on the horrific trade of enslaved Africans brought to work the plantations under the blistering sun. For 300 years, a caste system solidified. The criollosos born in Venezuela but of Spanish descent grew rich and educated. Yet they were treated as second-class citizens by the peninsulares sent from Spain to rule them. Resentment simmered like a pot left too long on the fire. By the late 18th century, the world was changing. The Americans had thrown off the British. The French had beheaded their king. And in Caracas, a generation of young intellectuals began to whisper about liberty. In 1810, the pot finally boiled over. Napoleon Bonaparte had invaded Spain, throwing the empire into chaos. The grandees of Caracas seized the moment, forming a junta to rule in the name of the deposed Spanish king. But it was a ruse. The thirst for true independence was unquenchable. On July 5, 1811, Venezuela did what no other Spanish-American colony had dared to do yet. They declared total independence. But declaring freedom and winning it are two very different things. The Spanish crown did not take this lightly. What followed was not a gentleman's war. It was a descent into hell. It was a civil war as much as a war for independence, pitting neighbor against neighbor, royalist against patriot. The First Republic collapsed quickly, crushed by an earthquake that the priests claimed was God's punishment for rebellion, and by the Spanish armies. Out of this wreckage rose the figure who would define the continent, Simón Bolívar. He was a wealthy aristocrat from Caracas, a man who had toasted with princes in Europe, but who would spend his life in the saddle, surrounded by death. Bolívar was a man of immense vision and tragic flaws. He saw that Venezuela could not be free unless the whole continent was free. He became El Libertador. The war was brutal. At one point, Bolívar, desperate and backed into a corner, issued the decree of war to the death, essentially stating that any Spaniard who did not actively support independence would be killed. The rivers ran red. The fighting moved from the cities to the llanos, the vast tropical plains. Here, the war was decided by lancers on horseback, rough men who lived and died by the spear. Bolívar managed to win over the Llaneros, led by the terrifyingly brave José Antonio Páez. The turning point came on June 24, 1821, at the Battle of Carabobo in a field southwest of Valencia, amidst the roar of muskets and the thunder of hooves. Bolívar's forces routed the Spanish army. It was the seal on Venezuelan independence. But Bolívar wasn't done. He dreamed of a Gran Colombia, a massive, united republic comprising modern-day Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama, a superpower to rival the United States. He spent years galloping south, liberating nation after nation, but while he was fighting in Peru, his dream was unraveling back home. The territory was too big, the cultures too distinct, and the egos of the local generals too large. Venezuela chafed under rule from Bogotá. The man Bolivar had trusted, General Páez, began to pull Venezuela away. By 1830, the dream was dead. Gran Colombia fractured into separate nations. Bolivar, sick with tuberculosis and heartbroken, stripped of his power, tried to go into exile. He died near the Colombian coast, muttering that he had plowed the sea. Venezuela was finally a sovereign republic, free from Spain, but it was a nation born in blood. Bankrupt, decimated by decades of war, and lacking any institutions to keep the peace. The Spanish were gone, but the tragedy was just shifting its shape. The power vacuum left by the Empire and the Liberator was about to be filled by the era of the caudillos, the strawmen. The guns had fallen silent for a moment, but the struggle for the soul of Venezuela was only just beginning. With the collapse of Bolivar's dream in 1830, Venezuela found itself standing alone, a newborn republic with deep scars. The Spanish were gone, but the social hierarchies remained. The rich landowners held the power, the poor worked the fields, and the soldiers who had fought for freedom now felt they owned the country. This was the dawn of the age of caudillismo. A caudillo is more than just a dictator. He is a charismatic military strongman, a figure who rules through personal power and the loyalty of his private army rather than through laws or constitutions. The first of these was José Antonio Páez, the centaur of the plains. He was a hero of independence, a rough-hewn lanaro who had charged against Spanish cannons with nothing but a lance. He dominated the political scene for decades, sometimes as president, sometimes as the puppet master behind the scenes. Under him, the economy slowly tried to recover, leaning heavily on coffee exports. But the wealth didn't trickle down. The vast majority of Venezuelans were illiterate peasants, bound to the land in a system that looked suspiciously like feudalism. Tensions between the conservative ruling class, who wanted centralized power, and the liberals who wanted federalism and social reform grew so toxic that they exploded into the Federal War in 1859. If the war for independence was heroic, the Federal War was purely horrific. It lasted 5 years. It was a war of guerrilla raids, burning plantations, and massacres. The cry of the Federalist leader Ezequiel Zamora was horror to the oligarchy. The countryside was devastated. By the time it ended in 1863, nearly a third of the population had perished or been displaced. The result, a new constitution, technically, but in reality, just more instability. The late 19th century in Venezuela was a revolving door of coups, regional uprisings, and debts to European banks that the country couldn't pay. But then, in the early 20th century, something happened that would change the destiny of the nation more than any war or revolution. It started with a sticky, black substance bubbling up in the Lake Maracaibo Basin. The indigenous people had used it for centuries to caulk their canoes, calling it mini. The world knew it as petroleum. In 1914, the Zumac 1 well struck oil. It wasn't just a trickle, it was a geyser. Venezuela was sitting on an ocean of black gold. At the helm of the country during this discovery was Juan Vicente Gómez. The tyrant of the Andes. Gómez was a brutal, cunning dictator who treated Venezuela like his personal cattle ranch. He ruled for 27 years, crushing dissent with a ruthless secret police. But he also loved order. When the oil money started flowing, Gómez courted foreign companies Standard Oil Shell, the giants of the industry. They pumped the oil, and the royalties flowed into the government's coffers. Gómez used this windfall to pay off Venezuela's foreign debts entirely, a feat almost unheard of in Latin America. He built roads and unified the country militarily, but the wealth was concentrated in the hands of the few. When Gómez finally died in 1935, the country began a slow, awkward transition. The agrarian Venezuela was dying. The petrostate was being born. Peasants abandoned the coffee fields and flocked to the cities, chasing the oil money. The population exploded. By the 1950s, another military strongman, Marcos Pérez Jiménez, took power. He had a vision of a modern, futuristic Venezuela, flush with oil cash. He transformed the capital, Caracas. He built massive superhighways, the daring architecture of the Hotel Humboldt on the mountaintop, and blocks of modern housing. Under his rule, Venezuela felt like it was sprinting toward the first world, but the price was liberty. Torture chambers were busy, and freedom of speech was non-existent. In 1958, the people and dissatisfied factions of the military had had enough. A massive civic-military uprising forced Pérez Jiménez to flee on a plane to the Dominican Republic, leaving behind suitcases of cash and a country yearning for freedom. This moment birthed the democratic era. The major political parties, terrified of sliding back into dictatorship or falling into a communist civil war, signed the Punto Fijo Pact. It was an agreement to respect election results and share power. For decades it worked, while the rest of South America fell to brutal military juntas in the 60s and 70s. Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Venezuela was a beacon of stability. It was the place political refugees fled to. Then came the 1970s, and the world energy crisis. War in the Middle East sent oil prices into the stratosphere. Venezuela, now led by the charismatic President Carlos Andrés Pérez, was suddenly awash in unimaginable wealth. This was the era of Southern Venezuela. The government nationalized the oil industry. Creating PDVSA money was everywhere. The middle class took weekend shopping trips to Miami so frequently that they were known as the Dame Dos Give Me Two crowd because they would buy two of everything, one for use, one for show. The government subsidized everything: gas, food, electricity. It felt like the party would never end. Skyscrapers rose. The Concorde jet flew to Caracas, and the nation believed it had finally arrived. But it was a mirage. The economy was a hollow shell, entirely addicted to oil prices. The agriculture sector had withered away because it was cheaper to import food than to grow it. Corruption became part of the cultural DNA. The state became a giant patronage machine, handing out money to keep the peace. And then, the music stopped. In the early 1980s, the oil market crashed. The Black Friday of 1983 marked the devaluation of the currency. The dream of endless wealth shattered overnight. Inflation began to gnaw at the savings of the middle class. The government, now deeply in debt, had to go to the International Monetary Fund (IMF) for a bailout. The IMF demanded austerity spending cuts, price hikes. On February 27, 1989, the pressure cooker exploded. After a hike in bus fares, riots broke out in the satellite cities of Caracas and spread to the capital. This was the Caracazo. People looted supermarkets, burned buses, and took over the streets. The government panicked, sent the military in to restore order. Soldiers, untrained for crowd control, opened fire on their own people. The death toll remains a mystery. Officially hundreds, likely thousands. The Caracazo broke the psychological bond between the people and the democratic establishment. The poor felt betrayed. The democracy that had been the pride of Latin America was revealed to be corrupt and unequal. In the barracks, a group of young officers watched the carnage with fury. Among them was a charismatic lieutenant colonel named Hugo Chavez. He began to plot, believing that the only way to save the country was to burn the system down and start again. The stage was set for a revolution that would shake the world. The smoke from the Caracazo eventually cleared, but the anger remained, settling deep into the barrios, the sprawling brick-and-tin slums that cling to the hillsides around Caracas. The democratic parties that had ruled for 40 years were seen as rotting dinosaurs, disconnected from the suffering of the common man. Into this void stepped Hugo Chavez. In Ijojoa, Chavez led a failed military coup. He sent tanks against the presidential palace, but the uprising collapsed. Surrendering on live television, he famously told the country that his objectives had not been met. Por ahora, for now. That two-word phrase electrified the poor. To them, he wasn't a traitor, he wasn't an avenger. He went to prison, but his popularity soared. When he was pardoned and released, he traded his uniform for a campaign trail, sweeping the 1998 elections by storm. Chavez wasn't just a president, he was a phenomenon. He rewrote the constitution, renaming the country the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. He spoke for hours on national television, singing, joking, and raging against the Yankee Empire and the local oligarchy. He tapped into a deep vein of historical grievance, promising to give power back to the people, and for a while it seemed to work. Fortune smiled on him. Oil prices, which were rock bottom when he took office, began a historic climb, eventually surpassing $100 a barrel. With trillions of dollars flowing in, Chavez launched the Misiones, massive social programs offering free healthcare, literacy campaigns, and subsidized food markets. Poverty rates dropped. The poor, for the first time in history, felt seen. But there was a dark side to this socialism of the 21st century. To fund this, Chavez cannibalized the economy. He expropriated thousands of private businesses, farms, and factories on live TV, pointing at buildings and shouting, "Expropriated." He fired thousands of qualified engineers from the state oil company PDVSA, replacing them with political loyalists. The oil industry, the beating heart of the nation, began to rust from the inside out. The country became polarized. You were either a Chavista or an enemy of the state. Institutions lost their independence. The courts, the electoral council, and the military all bowed to the executive. Corruption skyrocketed, with billions of dollars vanishing into ghost companies and Swiss bank accounts. Then, tragedy struck the leader himself. Chavez was diagnosed with aggressive cancer. He died in 2013, leaving the country in shock. He had anointed his vice president, a former bus driver named Nicolas Maduro, as his successor. Maduro took the wheel just as the wheels were coming off. The oil price collapsed again in 2014, and this time, there were no savings to cushion the blow. The destruction of the private sector meant Venezuela produced almost nothing. It imported everything, but now it had no money to pay for imports. The economy went into freefall. What followed was one of the worst economic collapses in modern history outside of a war zone. Hyperinflation arrived like a hurricane. Prices doubled every few weeks, then every few days. The currency, the Bolivar, became worthless paper. People began weighing money because counting it took too long. A cup of coffee cost millions of bolivars. The government responded by printing more money and slashing zeros off the bills. But you cannot print your way out of poverty. Shortages became a nightmare. Supermarket shelves stood empty. People stood in lines for 12-14 hours just to buy a bag of flour or a tube of toothpaste. Hospitals, once the pride of the region, lacked antibiotics, gauze, and even water. Patients died from treatable conditions. Newborn babies were placed in cardboard boxes because there were no incubators. Hunger, a specter from the past, returned to the land of grace. The average Venezuelan lost nearly 20 pounds in weight during 2017, a phenomenon darkly joked about as the Maduro diet. Political repression hardened. As protests erupted in 2014 and 2017, the government responded with tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition. Opposition leaders were jailed or forced into exile. A constituent assembly was created to strip the opposition-led parliament of its power. The United States and other nations slapped sanctions on the regime, crippling its ability to move money, which the government blamed for the crisis, though the economic rot had started years prior. Faced with starvation and hopelessness, the Venezuelan people made the hardest choice of all. They left. It started as a trickle of professionals, but it became a flood. The caminantes, the walkers, appeared on the highways of South America. Families carrying their whole lives in backpacks walked hundreds of miles, crossing the freezing Paramo of the Andes on foot, their shoes worn through, shivering in jackets meant for the tropics. They walked into Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, and Chile. Doctors became waiters, engineers became Uber drivers. By 2023, over 7.7 million Venezuelans had fled the country. It is the largest displacement crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere, surpassing the Syrian refugee crisis at its peak. Today, Venezuela remains a land of stark contrasts. The government has allowed a bizarre, unofficial dollarization to survive. In Caracas, Ferrari dealerships and luxury restaurants have reopened for the tiny elite connected to the government, creating a bubble of illusionary wealth. But drive 20 minutes outside the bubble, and the water taps are dry. The power grid fails daily, and teachers earn less than $10 a month. The tragedy of Venezuela is not just about economics or politics. It is about the theft of potential. It is the story of a country that had everything: fertile lands, endless energy, a vibrant culture, and an educated population, and lost it to the oldest vices of humanity: greed, corruption, and the lust for absolute power. From the stilt houses of Lake Maracaibo that inspired a name, to the battlefields where Bolivar fought for liberty, to the oil wells that promised a future that never came, the story continues. The Venezuelan people, resilient and battered, still wait for the day when the little Venice can finally live up to the promise of its land of grace.